The USS George H.W. Bush just crossed into the Mediterranean, and if you think you know why, you're probably wrong. Everyone's talking about the third carrier like it's just more of the same, more planes, more bombs, more American firepower pounding Iran into submission. That's the obvious read. That's what Tehran wants you to think. 2. Because while the world focuses on that story, something else is happening that nobody's discussing yet. And when it finally becomes clear, the entire calculation in the Middle East shifts overnight. Here's what we know on the surface. March 8th, the Jerusalem Post confirms the deployment. The carrier, fresh off intensive composite unit training exercises, is steaming east to join the USS Abraham Lincoln and USS Gerald R. Ford, already positioned around Iran. Captain Robert Bebeau, the strike group's commanding officer, issued a statement that should have raised more eyebrows than it did. Our job is to ensure that when they need us, whether for air superiority, strike, electronic warfare, or presence, we are ready to deliver immediately and without hesitation. Look at that list again. Air superiority, strike, electronic warfare, those are expected. But presence, that's the word that matters. And we'll come back to why in a moment. Right now, Iran is hemorrhaging. Lieutenant General Ail Zamir, the IDF Chief of Staff, went on record March 6th saying the U.S. and Israeli strikes have destroyed 80% of Iran's air defenses and roughly 60% of its missile launchers. Admiral Brad Cooper, leading U.S. forces in the region, added another data point that should terrify Tehran by March 5th. Iranian drone launches had collapsed by 83% compared to day one of Operation Epic Fury. Ballistic missile launches, down 90%. President Trump said 42 Iranian naval vessels were sent to the bottom in just 72 hours. The country isn't fighting back anymore. It's barely surviving. So why does the U.S. need a third carrier when two are already delivering this level of devastation? The conventional wisdom goes like this. The USS George H.W. Bush is there to escort commercial shipping through the Strait of Hormuz, neutralize Iran's swarm boat tactics, and give the Lincoln and Ford room to rotate crews and maintain aircraft. That makes sense. The strait is only 31 miles wide at its choke points, and Iran's been deploying fast attack boats and drones to threaten the 3,000 ships that move through there every month, vessels carrying nearly 20 million barrels of oil daily, worth close to $600 billion in annual energy trade. Iran knows it can't beat the U.S. military head-to-head, so it's trying to strangle the global economy instead. Having the George H.W. Bush arrive to clear that waterway is a logical countermove. But here's where the story everyone's telling starts to crack. The U.S. doesn't need a Nimitz-class supercarrier, a ship with 3,250 crew, 56 fixed-wing aircraft, 15 helicopters, Raytheon missile launchers, and Phalanx close-in weapon systems capable of spitting out 4,500 rounds per minute just to babysit oil tankers. You don't send one of the most sophisticated mobile air bases ever constructed, capable of launching aircraft every 20 seconds, to play whack-a-mole with Iranian speedboats. Destroyers and cruisers can handle that mission. They've been doing it for years. So what's the George H.W. Bush really doing there? We need to talk about what Captain Bebeau didn't say. During the 28-day pre-deployment training cycle, aircraft from the carrier flew 1,586 sorties and executed 1,375 arrested landings, 693 in daylight, 682 at night. That's not normal peacetime tempo, that's wartime intensity. U.S. fleet forces made a point of emphasizing accurate and rapid launch and recovery of air assets, which sounds like standard PR until you remember that the Lincoln and Ford are already providing more than enough strike capacity to pummel Iran. The math doesn't add up unless the George H.W. Bush isn't there to hit Iran at all. Stay with me, because this is where it gets strange. The carrier's air wing doesn't include F-35s, those are on the Lincoln, handling stealth penetration missions deep inside Iranian airspace to take out isolated air defense nodes. The George H.W. Bush carries 4th-generation F/A-18 Super Hornets, EA-6B Prowlers for electronic warfare, and E-2C Hawkeyes for airborne early warning and control. That's a very specific mix. It's not optimized for striking hardened targets inside Iran. It's optimized for something else entirely: air superiority and battle space management over open water. Now let's zoom out. The Gerald R. Ford crossed through the Suez Canal and positioned itself in the Red Sea, reportedly focused on deterring the Houthis in Yemen from escalating. The Lincoln is operating in the Gulf of Oman and Arabian Sea, launching strikes into Iran itself. And the George H.W. Bush is heading into the Eastern Mediterranean. Look at a map. These three carriers form a triangle that doesn't just surround Iran, it boxes in the entire Eastern Mediterranean, Levant, and Persian Gulf theater. That's not a siege formation, that's a net. Here's what nobody's talking about yet. On March 3rd, multiple sources reported unusual Russian naval movements in the Black Sea. The Admiral Grigorovich-class frigate, along with two improved Kilo-class submarines, conducted what Moscow called routine exercises near the Bosphorus Strait. Routine. Russia hasn't moved that much subsurface capability into position since the early days of the Ukraine conflict. Turkey controls the Bosphorus, and under the Montreux Convention, Ankara can restrict warship passage during wartime, but submarines operating in the Black Sea can still threaten the Eastern Mediterranean without ever passing through Turkish waters. Then there's this on March 7th. Just one day before the George H.W. Bush deployment was announced, the Chinese Type 055 destroyer Nanchang quietly departed Djibouti, where Beijing maintains its only official overseas military base, and began steaming northwest toward the Gulf of Aden. The Nanchang is China's most advanced surface combatant equipped with long-range anti-ship cruise missiles, sophisticated radar systems, and integrated air defense capabilities. The timing is not coincidental. Beijing hasn't said where the Nanchang is ultimately headed, but if it continues on its current trajectory, it'll be in the Arabian Sea within a week, well within striking distance of U.S. carrier groups. Now factor in Iran's allies, Hezbollah in Lebanon, still licking its wounds from the 2024 pager attacks and leadership decapitation strikes, has been uncharacteristically quiet. The Houthis in Yemen have launched a few token drone strikes, but nothing approaching the intensity they showed in 2024 when they were interdicting Red Sea shipping almost daily. Syria's barely a functioning state. Iraq's militias are staying put. On paper, Iran's proxy network looks neutered. But what if that's the point? What if Iran isn't throwing everything it has left into the fight because it's waiting for something? Let's revisit Captain Bebo's phrasing presence. The U.S. military doesn't use words carelessly in official statements. Presence doesn't mean blowing things up. Presence means being seen, being unmistakable, sending a message not just to Iran, but to anyone else watching. The George H.W. Bush isn't sailing into the Mediterranean to add 56 more aircraft to the 3,000-plus targets already struck inside Iran. It's there to make sure Russia and China understand that if they're thinking about testing American resolve while the U.S. is occupied with Iran, there's a carrier battle group sitting exactly where it needs to be to complicate that calculus. Think about what the U.S. has quietly positioned in the last 72 hours. The Ford in the Red Sea controls the southern approach to the Suez Canal and can interdict any Iranian proxy activity in the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. The Lincoln in the Gulf of Oman owns the skies over Iran and the Strait of Hormuz. And now the George H.W. Bush in the Eastern Mediterranean covers the only blue water route that Russian or Chinese vessels would use to project power into the region without crossing directly through U.S.-monitored choke points. The U.S. just created a triple-layer containment grid, and it's not aimed solely at Iran. Admiral Brad Cooper mentioned that rotation capability is key, that the three-carrier presence allows the U.S. to keep fighter jet waves fresh for an extended campaign. Trump said the war might last 4 to 5 weeks, maybe longer, but rotating carriers isn't just about pilot fatigue and maintenance schedules. It's about making sure that no matter what happens, the U.S. always has at least 2 fully operational carrier strike groups within 48 hours sailing time of any flashpoint between the Eastern Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean. That's not a rotation. That's a persistent theater-wide blockade disguised as a tactical deployment. Here's the piece that should be making strategists in Moscow and Beijing nervous. The George H.W. Bush's air wing includes EA-6B Prowlers, electronic warfare aircraft designed to jam radar, disrupt communications, and blind enemy sensors. The Lincoln has F-35s for stealth penetration. The Ford has F/A-18 Block 3s with advanced targeting pods. Together, These three carriers can create an electromagnetic umbrella over the entire region, degrading the ability of any adversary, not just Iran, to track U.S. movements, coordinate strikes, or communicate with forward deployed forces. The U.S. isn't just overwhelming Iran with firepower, it's establishing information dominance over a theater that spans three critical maritime corridors and touches the borders of NATO, Russia, and China. Now let's talk about what happens when the shooting stops in Iran. Let's say Trump's timeline is accurate and the campaign wraps up in 4 to 6 weeks. Iran's military is shattered, its leadership is decapitated, and whatever government emerges from the rubble is in no position to project power. What happens to those three carriers? Do they sail home? The Ford might. The Lincoln might. But the George H.W. Bush is positioned in the eastern Mediterranean, and there's no immediate operational reason for it to leave. It can sit there indefinitely, conducting freedom of navigation exercises, training with regional partners, and maintaining what the Pentagon will call a stabilizing presence. That's when Russia and China have to confront an uncomfortable reality. The U.S. just used Iran as a justification to position overwhelming naval power in a region that both Moscow and Beijing consider strategically vital, and now that power isn't going anywhere. The eastern Mediterranean is Russia's gateway to Syria and its only warm water naval facility at Tartus. It's also the western terminus of China's Belt and Road Initiative maritime routes. If the George H.W. Bush stays parked there, with the Lincoln rotating in and out of the Gulf and the Ford holding the Red Sea, the U.S. effectively controls every major shipping lane and energy corridor between Europe, Africa, and Asia. This is why the deployment of the third carrier isn't just about Iran, it's about what comes after Iran. The U.S. is setting the board for the next decade, and it's doing it while the world is distracted by headlines about bombed missile sites and sunken frigates. Dr. Michael Kaufman, a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, noted in a March analysis that the real test of American strategy in this conflict won't be how quickly Iran falls, but how effectively the U.S. leverages its post-conflict posture to reshape regional balances of power. He didn't say it outright, but the implication is clear. This isn't about winning a war. It's about locking in the peace on terms that benefit Washington for years to come. Iran probably realizes this by now, which is why Tehran's rhetoric has shifted in the last 48 hours. Instead of threatening retaliation or vowing resistance, Iranian state media is suddenly talking about diplomatic solutions and returning to negotiations. That's not surrender, that's recalculation. Iran's leadership knows it can't win militarily, and it's starting to understand that the longer this drags on, the more permanent the U.S. presence in the region becomes. Every day the George H.W. Bush sits in the Mediterranean is another day that Russia and China watch American naval power entrench itself in their backyard. But here's the variable nobody can predict. What if Moscow or Beijing decides they can't let that happen? What if Russia, already stretched thin in Ukraine, concludes that allowing the U.S. to dominate the eastern Mediterranean unchallenged sets a precedent it can't live with? What if China, watching the Nanchang close in on the Arabian Sea, decides this is the moment to test whether America can actually fight a two-theater conflict? The George H.W. Bush isn't there to start that fight. It's there to make sure that if someone else does, the U.S. is already in position to end it on American terms. 3 carriers, 1 visible mission, and a second, quieter objective that won't become clear until months from now, when historians look back and ask why the U.S. kept so much naval power in the Middle East long after Iran stopped being a threat. The answer will be simple because the real target was never just Iran. It was the question of who controls the waterways that connect 3 continents and fuel the global economy. And right now, as the USS George H.W. Bush steams east through the Mediterranean, that question is being answered in real time. Iran's watching, Russia's watching, China's watching, and none of them can do a damn thing about it except wonder what the U.S. saw coming that they didn't. Because when you deploy 3 supercarriers to fight 1 regional power, you're not planning for the war you're in. You're planning for the war you don't want anyone else to start. That's the surprise Iran just figured out. The rest of the world is still catching up.